Welcome back. In this episode, we're going to explore 5 lessons that have consistently helped my students improve their game and their mindset. This episode is going to focus primarily on longevity and how you can really maximize your poker career over the long term. The first lesson is that, in my experience, both coaching and playing poker, the worst downswings are not necessarily the largest downswings. The worst downswings are the ones that coincide with other major negative life events unrelated to poker. That's when a poker player is most vulnerable and susceptible to burning out. I think when a lot of people think about, like, what would it take to really knock me out of poker, at least for a while, if not forever, a lot of players will jump straight to, it's going to be the 100 buy-in downswing. In other words, the existential danger to me is facing an enormous amount of variance just within poker. But I don't think that's really the existential threat for most people. I think the existential threat is getting hit by bad variance in a bunch of different areas of your life all at once. So it's the 40 buy-in downswing, plus you go through a breakup, plus Bitcoin crashes at the same time and you have a ton of investments in that. Or maybe you have some sort of like health issue at the same time. We often hope that the really bad things that happen in our lives are going to be like spaced out pretty evenly, but that's not how random events occur. Random events are often clustered. So I think whenever you're thinking about the worst case scenario, it's worth thinking about, what if a bunch of different things go wrong all at the same time in different areas of my life? And that's obviously a very complicated subject, and I think you could write a whole book on that. But ultimately, I think it boils down to dealing with things before they become a huge problem, and also limiting your exposure to sort of like black swan events. There's a book by Nassim Taleb called Black Swan, which might be interesting reading material on that subject. Let's take a quick break so I can tell you about my program, the Mobius GTO Stat Checker, which is now available for both MTTs and cash games. This program automatically compares your stats to solver data and pinpoints where you're off track, color-coding your stats to show you where you're too passive or too aggressive compared to GTO. You can also use this program to analyze your opponent's tendencies and exploit their mistakes. For example, you can easily figure out how often your pool is bluffing on the river, and therefore how often you should be bluff catching. Plus, it's great for evaluating the quality of your games. You can check the average win rate of the regulars in your pool, or see how many hands in your database were played by recreational players. The Mobius GTO Stat Checker takes the guesswork out of your study routine so you can focus on fixing your leaks and exploiting the leaks of your opponents. This course includes video modules to walk you through how to use the program and a support channel to make sure that you never get stuck. You can click the link in the show notes to learn more about the Stat Checker and purchase a copy for MTTs or cash games today. Lesson number 2 is, if you think you need to play every session flawlessly, remember that Napoleon's definition of a military genius is the man who can do the average thing while everyone else around him is going crazy. Now, poker is not nearly as high stakes as actual warfare, but it is still very mentally taxing, and it is a high pressure situation. And a lot of your results in poker are going to depend on how you handle that pressure. It's not how well you play on your best days. That's not all that matters. I think what also matters is how poorly you play on your worst days. Or to put it differently, like, really just what does your average session look like? What is the quality of your average poker session? That's truly what is going to impact your results over long periods of time. And so that is more about creating systems for getting like the most juice out of each session. And there's just infinite ways that you can do that you can optimize your pre-session routine, what you do during a session, the types of breaks that you take. I mean, you don't want to go out and like buy the most expensive chair and the most expensive monitors and things like that. But I do think investing time and money and energy into figuring out exactly how you can perform the best, particularly in the areas that you find yourself struggling in, that's the most important thing to focus on. So the thing that somebody else is struggling with, you know, the the chair that they're sitting in might matter more for them than it does for you. I will say that I have also seen some very rare exceptions who like poker players who just don't even focus on this stuff at all and still seem to have very, very good results. Sort of like savant type poker players. Those definitely exist too, but I'm more talking about the average person who actually does need to optimize their pre-session, mid-session, and post-session routines to get the most out of their performance at the tables. Another important takeaway from this Napoleon quote is that maybe you don't need to put so much pressure on yourself to make the sickest plays. It's not really what is going to drive your win rate, is really like finding those above the rim type plays. Because overemphasizing that type of performance is, I think, more likely to just lead to you burning out than to actually make you tons of money. That brings me to the third lesson, which is success in poker is highly correlated with longevity. Longevity isn't about being better than everyone else. Longevity is about putting in a consistent amount of solid effort over long periods of time, which is much easier said than done. If you're the type of player who only has poker in their life and spends 12 hours a day playing and studying poker, that may work for the next couple of years, but you really want to be thinking about how am I going to make this work over a 10-year period or a 20-year period? Because not having a balance combined with the stress and pressure that comes with playing poker as a career is a pretty deadly combination. And maybe you don't see yourself playing poker for 10 to 20 years, but I think nobody wants to end their poker career, even if it's in a few years, completely burnt out. This lesson also makes me think about the idea of deliberate practice, which my friend Matt Marinelli talks about all the time. The way that you get better than everyone else is not really about raw effort in the short term. It's more about showing up every day and getting a little bit better every day and then compounding that over years and years. So Matt is one of the best players in the world at this point, and he has been doing his morning hand review sessions for years now. He has a whiteboard on his wall behind him in his office with his tasks of things that he's going to study that week, and he's very organized about it. He also has a lot of raw talent, but I don't think it's a mistake that he's gotten as good as he's gotten because he just has this structure to his poker routine that a lot of the competition just doesn't have. And over the years that I've known him, I've seen that really just build and build until it gets to the point where you look at his skill level and you think, well, I could never get there. Well, maybe you could get there, but it's just going to take, again, consistent effort and deliberate practice daily over the course of years, which is something that a lot of people aren't willing to do. The fourth lesson is about mistakes and how we view mistakes, because there's productive ways to view our mistakes and there's unproductive ways to view them. When you make a big mistake, especially early on in your session, but really any time, you might think, well, I just blew my win rate for this entire session. It's understandable to view mistakes as setbacks, but one thing that you have to remember is that you have always made mistakes and you're always going to continue making mistakes. Your win rate up to this point has mistakes that you've made in the past already priced into it. So in other words, if your win rate over your career is 4 big blinds per 100, that win rate is the sum of all of the plus EV plays and the negative EV plays that you have made in the past. So again, if your win rate is 4 and you make a 10 big blind error in the beginning of your session, you might think, well, it's going to take me 250 hands to recover the error that I just made. And only then can I start profiting in this session. That ignores the fact that you have made many mistakes in the past and you were still a profitable player. So you can be profitable even though you make mistakes. That is a fact. What is going to make you progress as a poker player is not never making mistakes. That's not necessary and it's not realistic. Rather, you should just focus on making smaller and smaller mistakes over time. You can also go a little easy on yourself because you might not have ever been put in a situation quite like that before. Okay, so it's one thing to make a mistake once. You shouldn't really mind making a mistake once. It's repeating that mistake over and over again. That's what you should try to cut out. So when a mistake is made, you can be sure to mark it for review after your session. And then what I like to do is sort of a post-mortem on a really big mistake. So figure out what exactly happened in this situation. How was I feeling at the time? What confused me about this hand? What assumptions did I make that didn't pan out? And then you try to work out how can I create systems or mindsets that make me less likely to make this mistake in the future. For example, you might find that when you make a big hand early on and the board runs out in a way that completely changes everything and the relative strength of your hand goes down quite a bit, you might find that you're anchored to the strength of your hand and what it was in the beginning of the hand. You can't calibrate or adjust in time to make the proper decision on the river when the 4-card straight or the 4-card flush comes in. But if you know that about yourself, you can be more vigilant next time that pattern arises in your next session or maybe the session after that. And you can be more aware that this is a danger zone for me. This is a spot where maybe when I'm getting this kind of feeling in my chest or wherever it is, you need to take a step back and breathe for a second before you make a split-second decision. Whatever the solution is, once you do find a way to be more confident that that mistake is not going to happen again, or at least is going to happen less often or be less severe when it does happen, then you file away that mistake because it has served its purpose and it's not worth dwelling on it anymore. A lot of times it's not even like a huge mindset breakthrough that needs to be made. Sometimes you just didn't have an understanding of how, I don't know, maybe the correct sizes to use on a monotone board or how often you're supposed to slow play value in a monotone board situation. It might be something like that. And then that just gets put into your list of tasks that you're going to practice in your next study sessions. And that's all it is. The mistake has served its purpose and you can move on. So I think this idea of not eliminating mistakes, but just focusing on reducing mistakes is a really important mindset shift. Real quick before I jump into the next lesson, if you're enjoying the show, please subscribe. I put a lot of effort into putting out these podcasts each week, and your support helps me keep going. The fifth lesson is if you want to be really successful in poker, your approach to the game needs to somehow be fundamentally different from the average poker player. If you're not sure whether your approach is fundamentally different in some way, then the answer is it's not. You would know. One of the ways that I sort of was able to separate myself from the competition when I started playing poker early on was I focused on my strategy against recreational players, whereas almost all of the training content that I saw out there at the time was all focused on how to play against regulars. Whereas I recognized the recreational players at my table are where the vast majority of my win rate is coming from. And therefore, any gains that I can make against those players they're going to have an outsized impact on my total win rate. So I'm going to optimize my strategy against the recreational player first. And then after that, I will focus more on picking the higher fruit, the more difficult spots to get good at, which is, getting that last bit of edge against the average regular. Of course, my study wasn't that segregated. Like, I obviously did study theory while I also studied how to play against recreationals. But the point is, my priorities were in the right place, I think. I think because there are so many regulars at the table, it's the most common opponent that you face. It can be easy to get tricked into thinking that you need to focus on them the most. But the fact is that almost all of your money is concentrated into a few players that you're playing against. Another thing that I think is really important is how you approach technology in poker. And this is getting harder and harder these days because of cloud-based solvers. Particularly GTO Wizard is just so good, and it gives the average poker player so much information that typically you would really have to mine sims for a very long time. You'd have to be tech savvy. You would have to have the type of hardware to run all of these simulations. It's time consuming, costs a lot of money, requires a different set of skills from playing poker. And now, like, GTO Wizard is just sort of gifting a lot of this to anyone with a subscription. And it becomes a lot more difficult to find ways that you can use solvers and technology to get above what the rest of your competition has access to. That doesn't mean it's impossible. It's just more difficult. And that's one of the biggest things I would say I'm focused on now is, and I have been, focusing on, for the last couple of years or so, creating proprietary software to allow me to study poker differently from how everyone else is studying. So I'm looking at GTO Wizard and I'm looking at what people have access to. And I'm thinking about ways that I could separate myself. What is GTO Wizard missing that people might not be looking into? And I know that's a bit vague, but ultimately I think what it amounts to is you can still exploit players, but you have to do it in a much more clever and calculated way. I think that you can't really come up with as many totally unorthodox strategies that should just never be a thing in theory and that lose money in theory. People are much better at adapting to strategies like that now. But there are still unorthodox strategies which are a lot more acceptable in theory. So I think that is a big area of focus for me right now. But the topic of GTO Wizard is really interesting. I'm definitely going to do an episode on that at some point, just about GTO Wizard, because I think it's just totally changing the game. Finally, another idea for how you could separate yourself from the crowd and come up with your own approach to poker, which is something I already mentioned, which is what I'll call like the Marinelli approach of treating poker as a business rather than entertainment, and having disciplined study habits rather than casual learning. Setting clear goals for yourself and keeping yourself accountable to that. Of course, this gets harder and harder every year, I think, as poker becomes more of like a serious profession and the easy money goes away. It becomes harder to just outwork the rest of the competition. But I do think that specifically in poker, there is still quite a bit of room for just approaching the game more seriously and in a more professional way. That's a wrap for this episode. Thank you guys for tuning in. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss any future episodes. Your support means a lot. Until next time, good luck at the tables.